I'm here to answer some of your frequently asked questions on our discussion board and just do a little bit of review of guided reading. One of your questions was, and this is always a great question, do guided reading materials need to be purchased by teachers or are they bought through the school district? Well, that's sort of a tricky one. Realistically, they should be bought through the school district. Sometimes though, when a district decides to undertake doing guided reading, they don't have enough materials and then you're sort of left to search for them on your own. A really great reading site is Raz Kids, and Reading A to Z is really fantastic too for books. And you can also use any Basel Reader materials that your district might have for you, and you can just level those materials on your own. Another question that I saw a couple times was, what do I do when one child is significantly ahead or behind the others in a group? Well, that is always tricky. Very rarely do you ever get a class where you have 4 neatly put together groups. What you have to do is you just have to do your very best to match them by ability, by what they need. If you have a significantly low reader, they're going to benefit from whatever your lowest reading group is. And typically that reader also will receive Tier 3 RTI support or support from the IST teacher. Hopefully if your school does reading recovery, a lot of times mine that were significantly behind ended up getting reading recovery, which really pushes them forward pretty quick. As far as kids that are ahead, you just have to be able to, if you want them in your guided reading group, they can read with your highest level kids, but then you can also group them you can read with them during reading workshops. You can give them books to take home to read, and you can challenge them in other ways. Especially with the little ones in first grade, it's pretty tricky because those with really great high reading levels, there's often not a lot of books that are developmentally age appropriate for them as far as content wise. They haven't had the life experiences, and they're not emotionally ready to read a lot of those middle level chapter books. So as long as you know that you're just trying to get them to love to read, and whatever you do, you want to challenge them, but making sure that your most important thing that you're doing is making sure that they're enjoying reading. What would you do with students that are on the same reading level but do not work well in groups together, or other behavioral issues? This really goes back to just how you build community in your classroom and really classroom management in general. I just didn't stand for it. We did a lot of class meetings, we did a lot of just building classroom community, and I really didn't have very much of a problem with it. When I found a problem would be when the students were to be doing independent work, and it typically wasn't that they were not getting along, it was typically they were getting along in ways that they could find trouble. But you do have to definitely be aware of that, especially when they're doing their independent work. 2 really great questions were how to include a student with a disability in guided reading and how to include your ELL students in guided reading. And my answer is similar to both. Both of those students are going to be pulled out to get special services. Your learning support or your other students with different learning disabilities, they will get their special education instruction. But they will also benefit greatly, even if it's just from the language and the book orientation and all the concepts about print and just the talk about books. It's the same thing with the ELL students. You're going to try and hit them at their best language level that you can, but you're also going to make sure that they get their supports they need with their ELL teacher. One thing that I did was, and I will talk about it when I talk about groups, I tried to make sure that both of those students saw me, and then during one of their independent centers, which might not be as beneficial, that's when they went to go see the reading specialist or the special education teacher, or the English language learner teacher. One of my favorite stories is when I was teaching second grade. I think it was second grade. No, it might have been first grade. I had 2 students with Down syndrome in my class, and one of the moms said that she wanted to work on getting the kiddos included as much as possible. And I thought, oh my goodness, how am I going to include them in guided reading? Because they were still learning their letters and letter sounds, and we were reading books. And I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this. And I'm so glad that that mom set that challenge in front of me, because I was able to figure out a way that the students could join my high group, and then my readers would take turns reading to them, and they would get all that language and they'd get all that books. And the best part was that they were able to participate in those discussions and the grand conversations about the books that we were reading. And it was just really worked out really well. And by the end of the year, when they were reading themselves, then they could come and bring their books to our class and read as well. But it really ended up working out really great. And those students are going to get something just from the book talks and the books and the way books work and the book language, sitting in on those groups, even if they're not at their perfect level. How long would you typically spend on the same book for guided reading? This is actually one of those questions where it depends on what philosophy you believe in. Some reading gurus that you will read will say you spend multiple days on the same book. Some will say that you should get a new book each time you come to the guided reading center. In first grade, I typically only spent 1 day per book, especially if it was a book like I like my hat, I like my gloves, I like my scarf, because there's not much exciting with that. What I made sure though was that I would give the students a Ziploc baggie, a gallon baggie, the freezer kind, because they're stronger, and every time we read a new book, I would put it in their Ziploc baggie, and their only homework for reading was to take that book home and to read it with their parents. And I would keep a good 5 or 6 days in that Ziploc baggie, and then on the 6th or 7th day, I would switch out the book. So there was lots and lots of opportunities for multiple rereading, which is so great for fluency and building sight word vocabulary. One way we did do multiple books is towards the end of first grade, and when I taught second grade, we did a lot of chapter books. So obviously you're not going to finish a chapter book in 1 day, and we would section off the books. And I would find with some of my more precocious readers, they would want to take the book home and just finish it. So I used to put paper clips on the book. And I would say, I know exactly where that paper clip is. And if you moved it, I know you went ahead and you read. And I would tell them it's like a lock on the book that you can't read ahead. So we would, read chapter by chapter or section off depending on how long it took us to read. And that was always a lot of fun to read those really good chapter books towards the end of the year. The question of the day was, what is the best way to organize and manage time when you have a large class such as 28 or more students? And that's a thorn in my personal side, because I actually did have 28 students my last year teaching, and I never had less than 20. I know I lied. 1 year in second grade I had 22, but I never had less than 25 students. And it can be a super big, huge challenge, because these reading groups are supposed to be 4, 5, 6 kids, and you do the math, and that just doesn't work out when there's 28 kids in my class. So typically we would do this in class, and I would make you switch groups, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about what my schedule looked like and how I used to deal with groups. One of the other questions you all asked was, how often do you change groups? You change groups all the time. You're always assessing kids, you're giving them a running record before you're picking one child to observe and to give a running record for each time you meet with them, and you're giving them the F&P 3 times a year. And sometimes, like I always say, kids will come back from Christmas break and they get the Christmas gift. it's like bammo, they suddenly know how to read, or they suddenly turn 7, then they come to school the next day, and I'm like, they just learn to read, and it's really neat. So you're constantly having kids grow and mature and learn things. So these groups, this is the actual paper I would use, and I would just do it on this kind of paper because I never laminated it, and you know me, I laminate anything that doesn't walk. So I would just write their names, and I always had a secret code. Red was my low group, they were the warning, and then orange was next middle low, and then we had middle high, and then we had the high group. And when I had 28 kids in the class, I had a blue group as well, which was another high group. I'm going to show you my mornings and my daily schedule. This is from the best of my ability, what I could remember, what I did every day when I taught first grade. And you can see we had 8:05 was when the doors opened, but the bell actually didn't ring until 8:20. So we had just some morning routines, and then we did calendar, and then we did math. And math is really supposed to be 70 minutes long, but in first grade, 20 of those minutes counts for calendar. So you can see that's why I have about 50 minutes for math. And then I gave myself about 10 minutes for my intro to reading, a little strategy reminder telling the students what the centers were for the day, just give them the kind of lay of the land. And then from 9:50 to 10:15, I did my first reading group. And you can see that's my only reading group when I have 28 kids, that I have time for a 25-minute long reading group. I always did the red group first because typically some of those kiddos were getting pulled for reading recovery or for other services during this time, because I didn't want them to get pulled when they were working with me. I wanted them to get pulled from an independent center. So then we took a recess, and then after recess, I did 4 groups in a row, and we had it down to a science where our transition time from group to group was less than 60 seconds. The kids really enjoyed it. They liked the structure. And it really, I will tell you, made the time from recess to lunch go lickety-split. And then after lunch was kind of a conglomeration of everything else. I have word work and poetry, but the poetry was typically an intro. So like if we were learning about Arbor Day, we would do an Arbor Day poem, and then we would go into a read aloud where I would teach a reading strategy. But then we would also be learning, my read aloud would have to do with Arbor Day, and then we would learn the content. It would be a big integrated lesson. So, and specials is squeezed in between there for first grade. So it's not a lot of time, but we did a lot with this time. Typically, this is what this would look like. So first thing at 9:50, I would have the red group. The orange group would be at a listening center. The yellow group would be with Mrs. Trout. I did have an aide 3 days a week, and the 4th day a week I had a parent, and typically on Fridays I either did just 2 or 3 centers and combined groups, or I just did a big shared reading with a good shared writing, and I did a lot of strategy work, and I didn't do guided reading. I would probably not do guided reading probably every other Friday, because as you can see, it's really difficult to do when you don't have an aide, because that would be 20, 40, 60, 80 minutes of independent work without a grown-up. And then the first group, the green group would go to word work, and the blue group would go to silent reading. And then what I would do is, after recess, I would go up to the board, and I would just move everybody down. And typically, right after recess is where my red group would go up to do their reading recovery. The blue group would be with me, the orange group would be with Mrs. Trout, the yellow group, and then the green group. And then we would just do that and switch, and then everybody would get to every center every day. And that's one of those other things that's kind of like teacher choice. Most models do a 3-2 model, where you see one group, you see your middle and middle low groups 3 times a week, and you see your high and your middle high groups twice a week. In first grade, I just don't think that's enough. I feel really strongly that I need to see all my groups every single day. I especially see this red and orange group every single day that I do guided reading, for sure. At the emergent level, getting a new text every day and getting those words, and it just, the progress you make is really incredible, and missing a day would, I think, really interrupt that. The other thing is, there's been times where I've had these kids that come in and they're reading at a level 18, and you're like, wow, they're really great. And then all of a sudden you give them the F&P, and you're like, wait a second. You know, it's December, they've gone from an 18 to a 22, and they're reading the story, and they read it beautifully, and then you ask them questions, and they're like, and they can't remember, and they don't know what's going on in the story. And those are I think, for me, the trickiest kids. We call them word callers. And they read beautifully and suddenly get to a certain level of text, and their recall, their comprehension just goes down the tubes. And I feel like, what if I wouldn't have been me? What if I would have only seen this kiddo twice a week? And you know how it is in first grade. You plan to meet them twice a week, but then there's assembly, then there's a fire alarm, then there's, pet day or something. And, there could be a few weeks that go by where I only see them once or twice. And I just couldn't look this parent in the eye at parent-teacher conferences and say, oh, by the way, I was only meeting with your kid twice a week, and I just figured out it's December now, and your child isn't comprehending everything that they read. That I'd feel really nervous about. I think if you're going to do guided reading in second grade, that's a totally different story. I'm not sure that your upper readers need to meet with the teacher every day. They can do more of a reading workshop or a literature circles with them. But for first grade, I just feel really strongly as a first grade teacher that I need, every time I saw my guided reading groups, I wanted to see all the reading groups. But like I said, there were times my last year teaching, I had 5 in the green group, 5 in the blue group, and they were very comparable. So if there was an assembly in the morning, I might squish those groups together because they were all reading chapter books by Valentine's Day. I might squish them together and do a bit more of a literature circle rather than guided reading that day. But I still would definitely check in with them because I just needed to check in with them. I think that's it for all of your questions. But I do want to say thank you for hanging on this semester. It's been a bit crazy. And if you have any more questions, just put them up on one of our discussion boards, or let us know. I know that it's been nuts, and Dr. Norris and I aren't exactly fans of being in front of the camera, but I think that this, it's new for everybody. So thank you for hanging in with us. And the one thing I did want to tell you is, don't worry, because when we come back in the fall, Dr. McGeehan and I are both teaching all the reading classes, so we'll know exactly what your background is and where we need to pick up stuff, and we'll do guided reading again. And one of the first assignments